All right, welcome to the lesson for 10% and comparing other percents to 10%. Uh, if y'all remember, right before in-class sessions, in-person classes ended, we did our first percent class. We learned two methods in that class: the out of 100 method and the benchmark method. The benchmarks that we've learned so far are 50%, 25%, and 75%. So today we're going to learn how to do 10%. Just like the previous lesson, there's two handouts for this. The first handout has two problems that you should attempt before doing this lesson. They involve 10%, but you are able to solve both of them using one of the methods that we already know. Since we don't know the benchmark for 10%, that means you need to use the out of 100 method for these two. So take a second to do these two problems. If you would rather just move on to the lesson, that's fine. Now, in the lesson, I only review the first problem. Again, just to shorten the video, I don't want to take up too much of the time. So the company's profit is $400 in January. It increases by 10% in February. What is the profit in February? So we have to use the 1 out of 100 method, like we mentioned. And so we can break 400 up into 4 groups of 100. And then there's $10 for each one of those groups. So 10% of 400 is 40. And then 400 plus 40, since the profit increases, is 440. So the profit in February is $440. So what happened here? What do we go through? 10% of 400 is 40. If you look at those two, we just drop that last zero off of the 400 to get that 40. And we can see that that's true in the other problem too, and in this example I came up with. So when we see 10%, we remove the last zero from the starting value. Here's my example. 10% of 300 is equal to, I wrote 300 again, but I put an X over the last zero to kind of, visually represent what's happening. And then we get 30. So 10% of 300 is 30, 10% of 400 is 40, and so on. 10% of 500 is 50, of 600 is 60, and so on. So now on the back of this sheet, you should see more of these figures, okay? These 10 by 10 grids, we saw them in our first percent lesson, okay? So I want you now to fill in the first one for 10%. Just fill in the first column, or fill in any 10 you want. I just filled in the first column. So 10% is equal to 10 out of every 100. So we represent that as a fraction with 10 over 100. And we can simplify that to 1 over 10. Okay? And the benchmark is drop the last zero. Okay? Now, since we know 10%, we can figure out some other benchmarks now, like 5%. Okay? So in the next 10 by 10 grid, I want you to fill in 5 of those squares, because 5% means 5 out of every 100. As a fraction, that's represented as 5 over 100, which can be reduced to 1 over 20. Now, 5 is half of 10, so 5% is half of 10%. So if we can find 10%, we can find 5%. So if 10% of 400 is 40, 5% of 400 is 20, because half of 40 is 20. Okay, so we would drop the last zero, and then we would divide it in half to find the 5%. Okay, now let's look at a few more. 2 more. So 20%. I want you to fill in 20 of those squares, or just the first 2 columns. 20% equals 20 over 100, which is equal to 1 over 5. Okay? So 20%, or 20 is double 10, so 20% is double 10%. So if you're asked to find 20%, you find 10% first, drop the last 0, and then double your answer. And now let's look at 30%. 30% is equal to 30 over 100, which is reduced to 3 over 10. And 30% is 3 times 10%, so same thing as 20%. You find 10% first by dropping the last 0 off of the starting value, and then you multiply that new number by 3. Okay? So 20% and 30% were kind of just to show you that we can keep building. We can find any percent now that ends in 0 or 5. Okay, so I went ahead and wrote all of the benchmarks we know now with some examples. Okay? Starting value. 100% is the whole, okay? 50% is half. 25% is half of 50. 10%, we drop the last 0. For 5%, we take half of 10%. For 20%, we double 10%. For 30%, we triple 10%. For 35%, we add 30 plus 5%, or 25 plus 10%. For 40%, we do 10% times 4, and so on. Okay, so after this lesson, you can find a benchmark for any percent that is a factor of 5. Okay, so 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 25, 35, 40, 45, 50, and so on, okay? So if you can count by 5, you can find a percent now of that multiple of 5. And then these are just different starting values with sample percents of each one. The bottom one is a more algebraic approach. If that confuses you, don't pay too much attention to it. Okay? All right, and now the lesson is over. So if you want to move on to the handout, solving percents 2, that's great. I just want to talk a little extra, okay? So if you are already confused, you can just stop now and move on to the handout. If you want a little bit of extra information about percents, stay tuned. Okay? So what if 10% questions, what if they don't end in 0? In this class, we will always end in 0, but that's not always the case in the real world. So, for example, 10% of 100 is 10. 10% of 100.0 is 10.00, okay? So the decimal moves over to the left once, okay? So that's actually what we mean when we say we drop that last 0, because any zeros to the right of a decimal point can just be dropped. So 10.00 is really just 10. But I put the decimal point here this time to show you what happens if it doesn't end in 0. So 10% of 105 is 10.5, okay? Let's show how. 10% of 105.0 is 10.50. And notice we move the decimal point over once to the left. And that's why we get 10.5, okay? So 10% means move the decimal point to the left once, just once, okay? So for example, 10% of 107 is 10.7. 10% of 222 is 22.2. You won't see any questions like this on tests or in your handouts or your homework, because the benchmark we taught you is to drop the last 0. But again, just using your intuition, it should be obvious that not all numbers end in 0, but yet we can take 10% of numbers that don't end in 0. So when you come across that in the real world or in a higher level mathematics course, remember 10% means move the decimal point to the left once. All right. Good luck on the handout. The next lesson will be fraction slopes 1 and 2.